I want to welcome you here. My name is Rodney Tissue. I'm the city engineer for Hagerstown. Really thank you for taking the time to come out. We have this meeting here. We have this one later this afternoon or this evening. Just thank you for your interest in this subject. And the purpose of this meeting is to provide information to you about what we're up against as a community. And we also want to hear from you, your feedback and reaction to these things. So I'm going to start by giving just a short background, a little bit of an introduction, and then we have a video that kind of puts everything I say into pictures, and then David is going to provide a short presentation, and then we want to have a time of questions and hopefully answers. So we're facing a pretty heavy lift here with this whole stormwater situation. In 1972, the federal government, I guess President Nixon was the president then, passed the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act said that it's unlawful to discharge pollutants into the waters of our country. The Environmental Protection Agency is the agency of the federal government that is supposed to enforce that law. And what they issue is something called the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System Permit, that you'll hear us use the term NPDES. They issue these permits to municipalities and governments and industrial users. There's several industrial users in our community that have an NPDES permit. And what this permit's supposed to do is for local governments like the city of Hagerstown, we have a storm drain system and a network of pipes and ditches and things that are mapped on that map back there that is called the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, MS4. So the Clean Water Act was the law. NPDES is the permit that we get, and that allows our MS4 to discharge into the waters of the state and beyond. That's all gobbledygook, but we use those terms frequently, so I think those three things are important to understand. So in April of last year, Phase 2 communities in Maryland, like Hagerstown, received our NPDES permit from the Maryland Department of the Environment, who is authorized by the EPA to issue these NPDES permits. I hope that you're following all that. In that permit, which I have one here, our NPDES permit is in this notebook. Basically, it has things in there that we're supposed to do, like good housekeeping, and we're supposed to report certain things, and that we have to have a construction monitoring program. We have to look for illicit discharges, and all those things, we as staff, we have no problem dealing with those. But this permit has one other thing in it, and the really heavy lift that we're facing is that it's requiring us to treat or restore 20% of the impervious area of the city that isn't already treated. So basically anything built before 1980 that has no type of stormwater management, we're supposed to treat or remove 20% of that impervious area by the year 2025. When I say treat, it's either removing it or building structures that would collect water from it, clean the water, and then discharge it to the points beyond that. That's a significant thing to ask, and it's an expensive thing to ask. So for the next 20 or 30 minutes, what you're going to hear about is primarily focusing on that 20% reduction of our impervious area. The permit has a lot of other stuff in it, but that's the issue that we're really facing with. One thing I want to make very clear is this is just what we're proposing to do to deal with this permit. Nothing has been passed. We've briefed the mayor and council on this several times. They wanted us to have these meetings and to talk with various entities within the community. So we wanted to have this meeting, give you input, let you speak back to us. We're taking minutes of what you say. That'll all be shared with the mayor and council, and they'll make a decision probably around the end of this year. This is what's the word, meritorious undertaking. It's a good thing. Who's not in favor of clean water? The problem is it's a major undertaking for us to do this, and it's expensive. And we're not alone, as that one graphic shows back there. Other communities in Maryland are dealing with this. You've read about what's going on up in Pennsylvania in Greencastle and Antrim Township. West Virginia's dealing with the same thing. So everyone's trying to wrestle with how to clean the water before it goes to the Chesapeake Bay. So what I'd like to do is show you a short video right now. It's about 8 minutes. So Mike, don't fall asleep on us while we're watching this, okay? It's about 8 minutes, but hopefully it explains in visual what I just said. And then David Bulova is with Wood Consultants. He's been helping us work through this process. They've worked through this in many other communities, State College, Charlottesville, many cities in the Mid-Atlantic region. They've been a tremendous help to us. And he's got a short presentation, and then we want to hear from you all. So if we could watch the video, David, we'll do that.
The city's stormwater program is regulated under a permit from the Maryland Department of the Environment. And we've had this stormwater permit since 2002, but just in the last year, in 2018, they issued a new permit and updated some requirements in the permit.
A big part of our responsibility with the new permit that we've received from MDE and EPA is that we have to treat 20% of the impervious area within the city. Impervious areas are rooftops, sidewalks, blacktop, driveways, all those things that the water doesn't percolate through but simply runs off.
In the city the size of Hagerstown, we've calculated that means providing treatment for maybe as much as 400 or 450 acres of impervious surface. The city is looking at maybe as much as $25 or $30 million that we need to generate and try to have these projects online by 2025.
Folks that think if they live in West Virginia or Pennsylvania or on the Eastern Shore or way out in Western Maryland are going to sort of get away from this, that's not going to happen. So the city, like all of these other local jurisdictions, has to implement some fixes to some of these stormwater flow issues that are impacting the bay, just like any other jurisdiction does, because like every other jurisdiction, we have built up the environment around us in a very urban way over a long period of time without taking into account the long-term impacts that the quantity of flow generated from storm systems and the quality of that flow going into the bay has on that ecosystem.
And things that we're concerned about there are nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which pollute the waters and cause unhealthy areas and dead zones in the water. Also trash and sediment, which is soil being conveyed downstream. So on the flooding issue, what we're trying to do there is look at areas in the city where there's flooding of private property and issues that we just don't have the resources right now to address. On the water quality issue, what we're trying to do there is actually clean the water before it leaves the storm drain system and enters the waters of the state. So that might involve removing pavement, it might involve rain gardens, it might involve other methods that are called best practices to remove nutrients from the water. So when we received our permit requirements, the first thing that we decided to do was form a stormwater advisory committee. The committee is made up of citizens of our community, and they represent various parts of the community. We wanted a diverse set of voices to help us solve this problem in the most efficient way possible.
Our solutions may be very different, our sense of what stakeholders we may represent. There are of course differences there, but we have to kind of agree on the challenges so that we can be equitable and supportive of people in other groups, of other groups of stakeholders. So the conversation has been around how do we reward what's going well? How do we encourage different groups of interested parties to collaborate with each other, as we have been able to do at this table, and to sort of try and make a positive out of what is it's a challenge.
There are really two basic ways of raising revenue like this. One would be a tax increase that would affect all property owners that receive tax bills now. The other way is implementing what we're calling a stormwater user fee, and it's actually a fee that is based upon how much impervious surface you have on your property, because the more impervious surface you have, the more runoff you're generating, and really the more you're straining our stormwater system.
I'm sure that if you look at Frederick City, who's had this fee for a long time, and in some of the other jurisdictions that are adopting it, the city's going to have to implement some type of stormwater management fee that allows us to be able to pay for the projects that the state and federal governments are mandating that we have to do to correct those stream resource stormwater management impacts that we're having.
I would certainly contribute towards it. I lost a brand new truck. I had a brand new Isuzu box truck that I paid almost $80,000 for that got under 6 feet of water and was totaled. I lost another pickup truck, and we lost probably $50,000 to $100,000 of inventory from the building being flooded. So we lost a significant amount of money, and certainly would be happy to contribute a little each month or each year to help solve the problem.
During our time on the committee, we spent multiple meetings discussing a credit policy to help soften the blow of the cost for everybody affected. We discussed new construction, redevelopment, and also voluntary practices for the homeowners themselves.
As a church, we don't pay taxes. We're blessed by that, and we don't necessarily face that dilemma, which I know is a challenge for some people. We do pay our electric bills and our gas bills and all those sort of things. But as a church that has a lot of hard surfaces around it, as a large parking lot, we need to be aware how that impacts the system. Is it something we want to do and paying fees for that? Probably not, but it's something we need to do, something we're called to do, something that is important for us to do. So we will engage in the process. We will pay our part of keeping the environment that we care and love about as safe and as pristine for ourselves as well as for those who come after us.
It's important that the water quality of what's heading to the Chesapeake improves. The water that comes through here is just filthy. It's full of trash and debris, and every bit of improved stormwater management that we can do improves the quality of our drinking water and improves the quality of the Chesapeake Bay.
So we have a lot of work to do in front of us, and some of it's very expensive. But the first thing we want to do is figure out ways to kind of address the low-hanging fruit. And some of the things that we can do to improve water quality would be accelerate our street sweeping program to pick up more trash and solids off the street. Would be to actually physically clean out the inlets by lifting off the grate and sucking out whatever debris and trash is in there. And also be planting trees. I think you'll see a significant increase in the amount of trees that we plant every place basically we can find, because that gives us credits towards meeting that 20% pavement reduction goal. So we're standing here at a place that most people have probably never been to. It's in City Park, it's the north end, and behind me a large storm drain drains most of the west end. There's drains like this all throughout the city. This is just part of the network of drainage that conveys water from wherever it falls on the ground, eventually hitting the Chesapeake Bay. The thing about the system is that most of it's underground, so most of us don't even think about it. All most of us care about is that when it rains, that the water gets taken away. And where is away? It's just like when you have a piece of trash and you throw it away. Away is an actual place. And in this case, when something is thrown on the ground, on the street, and it's washed away, away is like the stream that we're standing here today. It's the Antietam Creek, it's the Potomac River. It's not good enough anymore for us just to say, as long as it goes away, it's fine, because it is affecting all of us. It has an impact, and when we all do that, it has a cumulative impact that's very significant.
since it's a relatively small crowd, and thank you very, very much for coming out today, if you have questions as I'm going through, or if I use an acronym that you're not familiar with, please just go ahead and raise your hand. If we wind up getting wrapped around the axle, we'll go ahead and set that aside, and we'll try to address it at the end. Also, after the formal part of the presentation, all of us will stick around in the back, and we're more than happy to have informal conversation with each and every one of you as long as you are willing to go ahead and stick around. So I guess about a week ago, I was searching through Netflix and came upon one of my favorite movies, which is A Perfect Storm. And it really did remind me a little bit of what the city of Hagerstown is dealing with right now in terms of its stormwater management program. And so we've known for a number of years that a lot of our local streams here in Hagerstown are impaired for different water quality violations. And so there's a number of streams that get sampled, and we already know that there are issues with respect to bacteria, with respect to what can live in there. And those are things that we need to address. We also know that the city's infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure, is relatively old, and that there is a need to really look at how do we repair and rehabilitate that program. But the thing that really kind of pushed us towards action was what Rodney went ahead and mentioned, and that is the Chesapeake Bay mandate to be able to do our part to help clean up the Chesapeake Bay by the year 2025. And so when it dawned, I guess when City Council realized, hey, all these things are converging together. We have legally mandated deadlines that we need to address and deal with. The first thing they did was to put together a stormwater advisory committee. And so we've had the pleasure of being able to work with that advisory committee since May of 2018. And so on a pretty frequent basis, we have met with these stakeholders to work through the program, develop recommendations, and now we're providing those out to you to be able to get your feedback. And so the advisory committee on purpose was made up of a very diverse group of stakeholders. And so we wanted to make sure that we had lots of different voices at the table with different perspectives to be able to provide us with feedback and to be able to anticipate what are the things that the residents and businesses of Hagerstown might be concerned about as we are tackling these challenges. So City Council, as they were charging the advisory committee, really wanted the advisory committee to tackle three things. And so the first one is, let's look at the program comprehensively. And so we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to look at the program from a macro level. And so they didn't want this just necessarily focus on the Chesapeake Bay mandate. They wanted to step back and say, hey, what kind of program do we need to develop? The next part, of course, is how do we go ahead and fund that? And how do we fund it in a fair and equitable manner? And then third, how do we make sure that this lasts for the long term? And so we're not looking at just putting infrastructure in the ground and then leaving it. We want to make sure that whatever recommendations or whatever funding mechanism we put into place actually is sustainable in the long term. So this is set up to be a three-phase process. And so the first phase was the advisory committee and getting them together, helping them understand what those challenges are, developing an initial program, getting feedback from them about what are their priorities and goals with respect to the city of Hagerstown, looking at what are those funding options that are out there, what have other localities in Maryland and across the United States used, and then presenting some initial findings to the City Council. And so that happened in November of 2018. City Council said, yep, we understand what you're trying to do. We think you're on the right track. Let's go ahead and move on to phase two. And so for phase two, the really big important part is what we're doing here tonight and what City Council or city staff will be doing over the next couple of months, which is getting the feedback from residences and businesses in Hagerstown. Other things that the advisory committee will be working on is refining those program costs. There's a lot of moving parts to trying to do that. And then refining some of the policy decisions that have to be made with respect to funding decisions. And then, as Rodney said, we'll be presenting that back out to City Council this December or somewhere around that. And if they decide at that point to move forward, then we would go towards the implementation phase, phase three. So Rodney did a really good job describing the key driver in all of this. And honestly, we wouldn't be sitting here today if it wasn't for the fact that Maryland and the EPA have really ramped up what they are doing with respect to Chesapeake Bay restoration. And so Rodney went ahead and mentioned the fact that Maryland's committed to cleaning up and restoring the Chesapeake Bay. I'll throw one more acronym out there for you, which is really important, which is TMDL. And so that's the other part that drives this. And TMDL stands for Total Maximum Daily Load. And so this is the modeling and monitoring that goes into place that says how many pollutants can enter into a water body without violating water quality standards. And so that's your goal. And so for the Chesapeake Bay, we have 3 pollutants of concern. We've got sediment, we got nitrogen, and we have phosphorus. And so what the modeling and monitoring does is say, hey, here is the amount that you can put into the Chesapeake Bay without violating water quality standards. Here's what's going in now, and then you know the delta. Here's what you have to go ahead and reduce that down by. So the modeling and monitoring actually is pretty good. And so even this last year in 2017, the EPA went back and said, how are we doing? Are these things still matching? And it did match pretty well, so we know we're on the right track. The hammer with respect to how to do this is the MS4 permit. And so in that MS4 permit, over the last couple of permit cycles, there's always been stuff in there saying you need to restore the Chesapeake Bay, you need to restore your local streams and creeks. The big difference with this one is that it actually has a deadline. And so no longer is iterative process or progress an acceptable outcome. Now what the EPA and Maryland is saying is you have to demonstrate a particular amount of progress by the year 2025. And so as Rodney said, the progress that you have to demonstrate is treating 20% of the untreated portion of the city of Hagerstown by that time period. And so as city staff has estimated, that's about 400 acres of impervious surface that needs to be treated. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the issue here for Hagerstown, so the red up here is the impervious area that exists as of today. And so you can see that's a lot of impervious surface. The areas that are treated by stormwater management facilities, those are in gray. And so those are properties that have been developed over the last 20 or so years that have stormwater quality management facilities on there. But as you can see, the vast majority of the city of Hagerstown is untreated. And so this puts you at a little bit of a disadvantage to localities that have more recently developed because they have a lot of this infrastructure in place. For Hagerstown, you are starting without much of that stormwater quality infrastructure. And so that means your 20% is going to be bigger than some other localities. So how are we going to do that? And so there's a couple of different ways that the city can tackle meeting that 20% restoration goal. And so up here on your, I guess it's this side of the room, a lot of the city was developed without water quality controls, but it was developed with some flood controls. And so you see these everywhere. They're kind of ubiquitous in developments that were built in the 1970s and 1980s. And what you could do is actually retrofit those to provide water quality. And so that's a pretty cost-effective way of going about this because you already have a facility, it's already established, you have the land, and it's a matter of going back in there and redesigning it in order to provide water quality control. So you have some of that you can take advantage of in the city of Hagerstown. The other one is actually retrofitting existing neighborhoods with state-of-the-art green stormwater infrastructure. And so these are a couple examples of what we're talking about. And so if you look over here, so this is a rain garden or a bioretention facility. And so what that does is you actually scoop out the existing soil. You put in soil that allows water to be able to percolate into the soil there, and it serves as a sponge. And so it mimics kind of your natural environment before you had a lot of impervious areas. And so those are things that could be used in order to improve water quality. Pervious pavers up here, and so if you've got areas that are parking areas that aren't used all that frequently, this is a good solution to be able to allow water to percolate into the soil and again not run off into your local streams and the stormwater system. Green rooftops. That's also another potential option out there. And then you have lots of different filtering techniques. And so this is a technique you might have seen in other places. It's a tree box filter. It's put into a storm drain inlet, and the water goes in there. It passes through a filter media, and then you've got a tree in there that helps to go ahead and lock up the nutrients and turn it into woody matter. So these are some of the things that the city could implement to retrofit existing areas. Stream restoration is also another popular technique. And so a lot of the streams in this area, and quite frankly nationwide, because of the volume and velocity of stormwater that comes off of our urban areas, have had most of their banks are completely blown out. And when you think about that, that's a lot of sediment and attached phosphorus and nitrogen that then gets plugged right down to the stream and ultimately the Potomac River and the Chesapeake Bay. And so one of the options out there that the city is looking at is restoring streams. And so you can see over here you've got this bank that's been completely blown out, and through stream restoration design, you can go ahead and bring it back to a natural habitat. And the nice thing is that you not only reduce the pollutant load, but you can also help to improve the ecology of the system. And then the last two things, and Rodney had really picked up on these two, which is tree planting as you convert a grassed or landscaped area where you're going to have runoff and you're going to have nitrogen and phosphorus coming off that into a wooded area. And then street sweeping also provides quite a bang for your buck as well. The bottom line is that it's a major infrastructure investment. And so again, this is infrastructure that we're talking about, and it's not inexpensive. And so the estimated cost just to meet the Chesapeake Bay restoration portion of all this comes out to about $22 million. And so when you think about it, trying to raise and generate and implement projects between now and 2025 and spending $22 million requires a Herculean effort. One of the things that the city is exploring and we feel pretty good about is that the wastewater treatment facility also has a permit under this exact same program with respect to the Clean Water Act. Because of some upgrades that the wastewater treatment plant has done, they are actually exceeding their permit requirements right now. And so under Maryland law, what the Maryland Department of Environment will allow you to do is take some of those credits from the wastewater plant and apply that temporarily to the stormwater program. And what that does, it doesn't replace the requirement that you put in the stormwater infrastructure, but it does buy you more time. And that makes a big difference when you're trying to finance stuff like this. And so the proposal right now is to take those credits from wastewater, and that would give you a chance to be able to spread those costs out, not to 2025, but to 2030. And we've met with Maryland Department of Environment, and we're getting confirmation, but they seem pretty good with that approach. They feel pretty comfortable with that approach. But either way, with that 2030, you'd need to generate revenue of about $2 million per year for the foreseeable future. So the other thing that Rodney hit on is the aging stormwater infrastructure. And so, again, most people don't think about the stormwater infrastructure. It's underground. You only think about it when things actually go wrong and you've got flooding. But it's pretty extensive, over 106 miles of stormwater infrastructure that manages that stormwater management. Again, the city of Hagerstown being a relatively well-established community, a lot of that infrastructure is over 100 years old. And so we are at a point where we are starting to see problems with that infrastructure. And right now, the city's maintenance program is largely reactive. And so what happens is that the infrastructure fails, and the city has to go in and then operate by maintenance by emergency. And that has a couple downsides to it. And so the first one is that you got to deal with the fallout from the emergency itself. And so you've got the road closure, you've got the flooding that's caused by it, you've got the property damage that's caused by it. And the other thing is that it's just flat out more cost efficient to be able to actually do rehabilitation before the failure takes place. It allows you to go ahead and be able to plan for managing your system in a cost effective manner. And so what the city is proposing to do is to get a better sense of the condition of the system. And so the city has done some closed circuit television of the storm drain system, but it doesn't have a sense of the entire system. And so that's step one, is making sure that we understand what the condition of that system is, and that allows us to strategically invest in upgrades and rehabilitation of the areas that look like they could potentially fail. And so this is just a good example of the kind of stuff that you see when you go into the storm drains. And so this is an old clay pipe. And as you can see, the thing is starting to crack and fall apart. And so eventually that's going to fail. And if it failed, you're going to have a parking lot's going to collapse. You're going to have a road that's going to go ahead and get a sinkhole in it. And so the idea is to identify these things earlier and avoid things like this. And so this is Antietam Street. And you know, this could have been caused by undersized infrastructure. It could be caused by a clog. It could be caused by a collapse. But you don't know these things until you actually go in and take a look at what that system looks like. In all of this, the advisory committee also saw the potential for an opportunity. And so in Hagerstown, it is a private property owner's responsibility to maintain the curb and gutter and the sidewalk out in front of their property. That's relatively unique to Hagerstown. There are other examples that are out there, but usually that's sidewalk and curb and gutter are actually considered to be part of a public good, and they are maintained by a public works department. And so the city had actually obtained an attorney general's opinion that said, hey, you know what? The curb and gutter can actually be part of your stormwater infrastructure. It is part of your stormwater infrastructure. And so what the advisory committee thought was, you know, why don't we go ahead and bring maintenance of curb and gutter under the stormwater program itself? And there is two really good reasons. Number one is that the cost to an individual property owner can hit pretty hard. And the second one is that staff has to deal with all these individual maintenance and repair items. And so being able to bring that under as a public program allows the city to actually take advantage of economies of scale when it comes to curb and gutter. And so that's the idea right now. That's the proposal that's been presented to City Council, is to take curb and gutter, put it under the stormwater program, and also take sidewalk maintenance and put it under the general fund and relieve individual property owners of that responsibility. So how do we pay for change? And so the big question for that advisory committee was what are the tools that are out there for us? Knowing that we're going to have to pay for these infrastructure improvements. And so we looked at the bottom two. So development fees are always a possibility. They're important, but they are related to new development typically. And then grants, which are also really wonderful if you can get them. But with everything that's going on, there's a lot more competition for those grants. And so those two bottom ones, development fees and grants, aren't going to be big enough to generate the kind of revenue that we need to invest in the stormwater management program. And so the two that we really looked at were the real property tax, which I know you all are probably very, very familiar with, and then a stormwater utility fee or a user fee. And so what is a user fee? Well, what it does is it basically kind of shifts the way that we look at stormwater and thinks of it more in terms of the way that we think about wastewater or water treatment. And so it's both a program, so you're looking at the program, the stormwater program, like a utility, like water or wastewater, and it's also a funding source. And so for a stormwater utility, those fees are placed into an enterprise fund, so it's different than the real property tax. They're all put into an enterprise fund that can only be used for stormwater management. And then you generate revenue based on the overall demand on the system. And so for a stormwater utility, the more impervious cover, the more the fee that you have on your property. So again, it's just a different way of thinking about how you treat and operate stormwater, shifting it from something that's an ad valorem tax to something that you'd see for water or wastewater. So there's a couple of different considerations when looking at a real property tax versus a utility fee. And I just wanted to hit on a couple ones that the advisory committee really honed in on. So the first one is real property tax it's value-based, right? And so it doesn't have anything in particular to do with stormwater. There's no nexus between the value of a property and what's coming off that. It can be accounted for separately, but there is no legal segregation. And so again, all those general funds can be shifted back and forth, and they compete on an annual basis with other things. It doesn't generate revenue from tax-exempt properties. And so if you are a tax-exempt property and you don't pay real estate fees, then you also aren't paying in terms of the stormwater management program. The good thing about the real property tax, of course, is that you can just increase the real property tax. It doesn't require anything special, and it doesn't require any additional billing mechanism. For the user fee, the advantages that the advisory committee looked at was it is impact-based, and so the more that you impact the system, the higher the fee. And you use impervious areas as basically a meter for allocating those costs. By Maryland law, it is legally separate. And so once it goes into that stormwater management fund, it is there. It can only by law be used for stormwater management. All properties contribute. And so this also includes federal and state properties. And so as long as the city is paying into the stormwater utility fee, then the state and federal government also has to pay into the stormwater utility fee. And there's actually a federal law in the books that says as long as you're not arbitrarily treating yourself differently, by law, those properties do have to pay into your system. There are credits or fee reductions for on-site stormwater management facilities, and I'll go into that in a couple seconds. The one thing that is additional for a stormwater utility fee is that you do have to maintain an impervious surface map. And so you can't charge based on impervious cover and not have a solid impervious surface map. And so that's something that the city already has. They are refining that. It's a matter of making sure that you keep that up to date so that your billing is as accurate as possible. So the major issue, of course, is who pays. And so I wanted to kind of illustrate for you in more tangible terms what this means and why it makes a difference. Because again, you're going to have to generate that $22 million one way or the other. And so you've really got two choices, and they impact properties in different ways. And so this is an example from the city of Rockville, which adopted a stormwater utility fee a couple years ago. But I think it really kind of highlights the difference between how these two funding mechanisms impact the same property. And so in this case, you have a very tall building that has a relatively small footprint, but it's worth a lot of money. And so in this case, a real property tax, if they were paying for the same amount of stormwater services, comes out to a little over $5,000. However, if you shifted to a utility fee, then it goes down to $1,283. And so it's a recognition that it's an efficient use of space. There's relatively small amount of impervious cover, and so the utility recognizes that by having a lower fee than if you were to rely on the real property tax. Kind of the flip side of that. And so this is a typical shopping center, a shopping mall, with lots of parking, lots of impervious cover. And so again, the question comes down to, how does this impact what you ultimately are paying? And in this case, you pay more under the utility fee. And so the utility fee recognizes that you're going to have a lot of impervious area, so you're going to be paying more under the utility fee than the real property tax. So on a macro level for Hagerstown, what does that mean? Because it does shift the cost distribution by land use type. And so up here on the top is real property tax, and you can see under the one up above for real property tax, single family detached are going to be paying a higher share than commercial and industrial properties, just again based on real property tax values. If you shift to a stormwater fee, that changes. And so now single family detached pays a little less, and commercial and industrial go ahead and pay more. And you'll also see the two other ones that pop up here. So you've got the tax exempt. They now pay for their share, as well as government properties go ahead and pay for their share as well. And so those are the ones that would have paid zero under the real property tax, and now they would have some portion of that cost covered by those properties. So The advisory committee, at the end of these deliberations, really looked at, again, it's not whether there's going to be cost impacts, but how are we going to distribute those cost impacts? And so, again, with respect to those findings, it was a matter of, all right, first of all, we got one bite at this apple. Let's make sure that we adopt a revenue source that is sufficient to go ahead and meet the needs that we have. Because the last thing we want to do is adopt a new revenue fee and then not have expectations be able to be met by the public. Equity and fairness were very important for the advisory committee in terms of what they were looking at. And as part of that equity and fairness, the conclusion was that all properties needed to be part of that solution, regardless of what their tax status was. And so that led to the conclusion that a user fee based on impervious area, the square footage of impervious surface on a property, and the idea was units of 1,000 square feet of impervious cover, that would be the most equitable approach to generating the revenue for the stormwater program. They also thought or agreed that yes, the city ought to pay its fair share. So that number one, it shows you got skin in the game, but number two, so that you can make sure that you're also able to charge federal and state properties. And so this is just an example of how that would work. And so again, in this example, we have one billing unit equals 1,000 square feet. So you would be charged in units of 1,000 square feet of impervious cover. For this one, you've got 3,345 square feet of impervious cover. Divide that by 1,000 and then round it, you've got 3 billing units that this property would be responsible for. And so to get to your fee, you would multiply 3 by whatever the rate is that City Council would ultimately go ahead and adopt. So the question that we often get, and not surprisingly so, is what is that rate going to look like? And so we have been working with city staff to make sure that we are able to represent a preliminary rate range to you. I will tell you that this continues to shift. There's a lot of moving parts, but we thought it was important for you to be able to get a sense of what that rate might look like at this point. And so there's some key assumptions that need to be refined. The program needs to be refined, the issue with credits with the wastewater treatment facility, bonding issues, but what we're looking for right now is a preliminary range of $30 per billing unit starting in fiscal year 2020, and then that would slowly ramp up to $40 per year in fiscal year 2025. And so that's by billing unit. So actually what's interesting is that both for single family residential as well as commercial, the median number of billing units on a property is 2. And so if you want to look at the median impact of a typical property in the city of Hagerstown, it would be $60 per year in 2020 and $80 per year in fiscal year 2025. A big note here at the end is that the proposal is to take the entire stormwater program and shift it over to an enterprise fund. And so right now, the city has a stormwater program, and that's paid for by the general fund. The idea is to take that all out of the general fund and put the whole thing into a stormwater enterprise fund. And so the general fund would be relieved of the cost of those existing stormwater management services. So I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out, that you've got a couple different things that are moving at the same time. So another question we often get is there a way to reduce my fee? And so an actual unique aspect of the user fee compared to real property tax is that yes, there are. There's actually 2 ways to do it. So number one, if you're able to reduce your impervious area by far enough, then you can go ahead and reduce your fee. The other part, though, is if you install and maintain a stormwater management structure on your property. And so if you do that, you are providing some kind of public benefit, your stormwater structure. And so the idea is that there would be a credit that would depend on the public good that stormwater structure is generating. So what's it worth to the program? And so there would be higher credit for voluntary structures. And so if you wanted to put something in voluntarily to reduce your fee, that would get the most credit because you're actually causing the city doesn't have to go ahead and spend that. It's a cost avoidance for the city. The other one that the city is looking at is a higher credit for redevelopment. And so the idea is that they want to be able to incentivize redeveloping areas of impervious cover that might be underutilized in the city. For those that were built as a condition of development that had to go in there anyways, they are good things. They're an important part of the city's program, but they would get the reduced amount of fee. And so right now, what we're looking at is a range of likely between 15 and 60% for a credit. And remember, that's a credit towards the impervious area that's draining to your facility, not for the entire property. But that's what we're looking at, is to have a credit range of 15 to 60% if you are willing, or if you already have a stormwater management facility on your property. The city is also very interested in providing incentives for property owners, businesses and residents to be part of the solution. And so the city is looking at two ways of doing this. One is for large-scale incentives, large-scale projects. And so this is where the city would approach a private property owner and say, you know what, your property would be a great place to put in one of those stormwater retrofit projects. And to be able to work with that property owner to be able to install that with cost share funding. And so the idea is that could be up to 50% in order to be able to make that happen. And so that's a very important part of the city being able to achieve those that 20% reduction by the year 2030, because quite honestly, there isn't enough public space in order for the city to be able to do what's on its own. And then the idea is to have smaller scale incentives that would allow any resident to be able to actively participate. And so these are smaller projects that may or may not be able to get credit, but again, if you get enough of them in the ground, they can be a good thing for water quality. And the idea right now is to partner with the Washington County Soil Conservation District, since they are already geared to being able to do that kind of technical outreach. And so a couple examples that the advisory committee was looking at and saying, hey, these would be useful things to make them Hagerstown specific. So one is being able to have cost share for impervious cover removal. And so, you know, for sheds or things like that that aren't being used, being able to actually remove those and replace them with a grassed area or some other kind of pervious area. Or, and this is not my car or anything like that, if you know, you're in the process of replacing a driveway, providing an incentive to be able to replace that with permeable pavers rather than just kind of your traditional asphalt. So I wanted to end on this, which is you are not alone. You are in the same boat because as Rodney said, you know, one of the concerns is, you know, how does this affect Hagerstown? Does this affect your competitiveness with your neighbors? And most of the localities around here are faced with exactly the same kind of situation that you're faced with, which is how to go ahead and pay for that. Each of them is developing their own unique solutions, as is the city of Hagerstown. But this gives you an idea of kind of the range of things that are being considered or already have been implemented. And a lot of them deal with implementing stormwater utility fees. And so the city of Frederick, Maryland has had one for a number of years. Their typical quarter-acre lot is about $54 per year, what they're doing right now. Chambersburg, Pennsylvania has an interesting system, but that comes out to about $48 per year. Gettysburg just adopted one where, depending on the size of your property, it's going to be $50 or $100 per year. But that just gives you an idea of kind of the range of things that are out there in this particular region. And then, of course, across Maryland, localities are also dealing with the same thing. And so if you want to kind of get a sense, we printed out a poster board with those numbers on there. But again, you are not alone by any stretch of the imagination. So in terms of next steps, we want to be able to get as much feedback as possible from you today. We have prepared a questionnaire, and so if you don't feel like piping up right now, we have those where you can go ahead and fill them out and turn them back into us either at the end of this presentation or later if you'd like to go ahead and do that. We also have Elizabeth. She's going to be taking detailed notes to make sure we go ahead and capture your feedback. We're also going to be meeting with additional groups, and so Rodney and Jim are going to be taking this on the road. One of the questions on that survey is, are there people who you think ought to be part of the decision-making process and might benefit from a presentation like this? The advisory committee is going to convene in September and October. We're going to review that feedback. We're going to continue to refine program scope and cost. And then we're going to develop those final findings and present those to the City Council work session in December. And then it's up to the City Council to figure out exactly what they want to do. But with that, thank you all very, very much for your attention.